How are you all? All right, so I believe in the schedule it said the title was What is Free? And I didn't figure that was quite enough, so we'll just say it's What the Bleep is Free. We're going to talk a lot about this concept of free. Just a quick fact, I am a graduate of 2 Australian universities, which many of you might be. I went to UNSW and to the University of Sydney by way of AGSM, which was a partnership back when I was here. But now I believe they've broken up, and it is just UNSW. And I was on campus a few days ago, and it was great to be back there. So thanks for inviting me back. It's wonderful to be back in Australia. Yeah. So I know you're here early, so let's see what we can do. So a little warning, caveat presenter, I guess it's presentee actually. I cannot guarantee your success. There are economists and researchers who act like they can do that, and I can't do that. I cannot predict the future. There are pundits and prophets for that sort of a task. That's not what I do. I can try to help you see the past in a different way, all right? And then hopefully as well also see the present in a different way as a result. So we'll do a lot of switching back and forth in terms of seeing things that have happened in a slightly different light, sometimes a light you might not prefer to use, but that's what I do for a living. So you may have heard that no one pays for music online, right? Back in the good old day, there was just simple IRC chat, and you could share files. Music was totally free. Hotline, invented in Australia, by the way, totally free. Did anybody use Hotline back in the 90s? That's a Wayback Machine. Napster, back in California, totally free, right? Kazaa, totally free, hiding in Sydney for a little while, I believe. The Pirate Bay, totally free. Mega Upload, totally free and on bail. Amazon's Cloud Drive, right? Totally free, first 5 gigs only, but in the USA only. And there's lots of different rules and laws, as we know, around the world that sort of alter whether or not something like Amazon can operate just out of the box for free or needs to go through licensing. But for all these opportunities and sort of choices we have for going online and accessing content and music, if I'm not paying for music, for what are we paying? We're paying for our internet connections, for the other wireless connections that we have. And that's what today is about, pretty much. So is this statement, in fact, true? Is it true that no one pays for music online? And what I'm going to try to do here is think a little bit outside the box and wonder, is it really, in fact, the case that no one pays for a little cable and a router? And in fact, fewer and fewer of us pay for our phones, even the really fancy phones. Everyone pays for music online. Oftentimes, we don't pay directly, and even if you don't get paid. And that's, I know, a challenge for many of the people in this room. And sometimes people wonder if that's kind of a joke, because I know you don't get paid. And that's the theme. So what is free? And we're going to sort of wander and riff a little bit around this concept called free. The first part of the presentation, we'll talk free versus free. I'm a college professor. I teach business. That means I love 2x2s. Is everybody familiar with the 2x2? All right, so any experience in life that cannot be broken up into 2x2 did not actually happen. Let's be clear. Pricing without price tags, otherwise known as hedonic pricing, not to be confused with hedonism, but we might deal with that. And then finally, the little finish in the end. And now those are the 3 subjects, and I'll kind of keep you up to date as to where we are, because this at times goes pretty quickly. We'll go through a few hundred slides. So that is my sister, the day after her divorce. And that's one of the sights of Cleveland. Should you ever go to Cleveland, sitting in the middle of Cleveland is a giant stamp about that big. She's not really small. The stamp is really big. So there's this concept we have called free. When you hear the word free, what do you think? And this isn't a rhetoric question. Just scream something out. What is the most expensive thing without charge? Okay. Awesome. Awesome. Anything else? No cost. So we're going to, no rules. So there's a lot of meaning to this word, right? It's only 4 letters. So now let's kind of work it for a little bit. So we'll focus on 2 of the ways in which people think of free. 1, free, given or available without charge. Thank you to the Oxford English Dictionary for providing us with this information, these definitions, which you can think of as free beer, right? And this is actually a brand of beer. Alternatively, we can think it as not physically restrained, obstructed, fixed, or unimpeded. That's the way, that's the short definition. Sort of like you are now free to move about the cabin, or free-flowing beer, right? Where essentially a spigot, right? You just turn the spigot and off you go. And now we have basically all it requires to understand the universe. There are 2 categories of free. There is free beer and free-flowing beer, right? And now we have the basic ingredients for a 2x2, and off we go. So basically, either the beer is free, as in free beer, yes or no, or it is free-flowing, as it is yes and no. And now we can split the world into 4 perfect categories, which of course overlap in no way. So don't think too hard about this, because then it explodes. First, no, it's not free. No, it's not free-flowing. That tends to be this product category of music, and we'll talk a little bit about that. Yes, it's free. No, it's not free-flowing. You might know that as the promo world, stuff that you give away in hopes of something else happening as a result. This, no, it's not totally free. You're paying for it, and yet it's free-flowing. This tends to be these service categories in music that we work with. And we'll talk about those. And finally, this question of the platform. When the beer is actually free and it's free-flowing, how basically this industry tries to find value in that category, the platform category. So first, this product category. You've all seen this, so we'll depress you right off the bat. This is the US recorded music industry turnover from 1973 to 2009. And while you may think that 2000 was the peak, because that was the most closest to where we are now, if you adjust for inflation, it's actually the case that 2009 was 43% lower than 1978. So for those of you who lived through the 70s, you actually experienced the heyday of music in terms of its true value as recorded music, or its biggest value. And that might make us a little sad, right? But it's important to understand that it didn't all just happen in the last 10 years. There's actually been a longer process taking place. So now let's look at all these different venues in which you sort of acquire music online or in physical spaces here. CD albums in Australia, add 3 extra zeros on the left, and put the word units, which I was supposed to do at 7 a.m. this morning, in the upper left. So those are recorded albums units over there on the left, and then the years in the bottom. And these are your record sales, right, over the last 8 years, declining album sales, right, and that makes us sad. And then it goes down to digital signals versus digital albums, right? So this whole online purchasing of the same sort of things, and the chart looks like that. Little hockey stick-like, right? So we have this increasing single sales happening over the last 8 years. And now you have more singles being sold than albums being sold, right? A greater number of. And that makes us happy, right? So we see charts that go up to the right. Everything should go up and to the right. So now let's look at it a little bit differently. Albums, digital and physical, bundled together. Singles, digital and physical. What's a fingle? That has to be an Australian word for something, because you have so many extra words. You have a bigger dictionary, I know. So let's look at it this way. Putting these things together and thinking of albums as albums, singles as singles, no matter how they're sold. Because you did actually have singles before there were downloadable singles. Some of you may remember. So this is what the chart looks like. Green is the singles, albums is in the blue. And there's sort of this crisscross happening, right? And if you notice, the crisscross around 05, 06, that's when sort of the two things start to go in different directions, all right? Which is interesting in Australia, that the local album scene really didn't get hit too much until the middle part of the century. So that sort of leaves us with a mixed response, right? Seems to be both going down and going up. What exactly does this mean? So now please forgive me for what I'm about to do, because this is not necessarily nice. A music buyer once said, "Few albums are true albums filled with great songs." I'm sorry. There usually are only 2 or 3 great songs on any album. So true or false, let's address the world as if this were the case. Let's convert singles to opportunistic album sales. So we'll assume people just buy the tracks they want to buy and don't buy the album. They're being opportunistic. And we're going to look at essentially these opportunistic album sales. So these were your recorded music album sales over the last 8 years. And now we're going to do some little multiples. Let's say every 5 singles sold might have been an album in a world without singles. And that's what the chart would look like. If we go to 4, 3, 2, is this smaller, bigger? I feel like it's an eye exam. And voila, you actually have a very different chart if you convert singles to albums, just by making the assumption that, in fact, consumers are being slightly opportunistic and buying only those tracks they really love. You could take this as sad, or you could take it as massive encouragement to make great music. And not even necessarily think always in terms of albums. So what you find is that if 3 singles were equivalent to what once was an album, sales would actually be flat over the last 8 years. And if 2.5 singles, they'd be up. So there is a relationship, we know, between singles and albums. We don't know how much of it has played into album sales over the last 8 years, but we need to understand that a little bit more and not always sort of ignore it. Also, you can't avoid it, right? Because it's consumer demand. There's sort of legitimate demand for singles sold as singles. So that leaves us a little verklempt, I think is the word. You don't really know what to do with that. It's a mixed message. So now let's talk a little bit about pirates, because they're because they're around, right? 2009, there was this great claim that over 40 billion files were shared in 2008, accounting for 95% of music tracks online. All right, so only 5% of tracks flowing through the interwebs were in fact purchased. But we have to ask ourselves, true or false? Let's give this a little bit context, okay? Oftentimes it's piracy versus sales, or the pirates versus the purchasers. Let's put them in the same bin for once, which may be a little bit awkward, and compare them to radio. And now let's look at music as something you experience, sometimes as a result of something you buy, and sometimes as a result of something you just happen to hear on this thing with a dial, and that's another legitimate music experience. So the number of unpaid and paid music downloads, 2003 to 2011, that's a really big number. So 396 billion, using all that data from the IFPI as if it were in fact true, that there were basically 40 billion files, really big number, right? Now I'll throw CD tracks as well, because they didn't consider CD tracks. So adding to it all the albums that were sold in the physical market, and now you have about 654 billion units of stuff, tracks sold over that 8-year period. And now let's turn it to listens. So that's about 3.2 trillion listens, assuming 5 listens for every track that was purchased over each year. And we'll adjust that later to give it a bigger number. But we're basically saying people buy an album, they listen to it 5 times every year for over 8 years. Now let's look at radio. We'll focus on Australia. Aggregate audience hours spent listening to broadcast radio, about 146 million hours. This is all the hours for all the people. All right, so counting each person in each hour. Estimated weekly number of music listens. So now saying how many tracks are there per hour on radio, given how many hours you listen, that's 1.4 billion listens across broadcast radio in just a week. All right? And that's counting each song for each listener, which is not the way in which people often count songs and listeners for radio. So the total number of music file listens across broadcast radio in Australia for the 8-year period was about 685 billion, which gets really big and really close to that CD number using simply Australia. So now let's go big. Global, 2.2 billion global listeners to music. Get out the calculator, make a few assumptions, because that's what we do, right? 293 trillion possible listens to music files across radio for the 8-year period, all right? Now, if we put record sales in the context of these listens, oh wait, don't forget internet radio, sorry. It adds a little bit of an upticking, and it's getting bigger. That's it. Assuming 5 listens to every album you purchase every year, the number of listens that occur by way of CDs sold is actually about just roughly 1% of the music we experience compared to radio. If we say it's 10, because I'm being cheap, it's 2%. So actually, a massive proportion of the music people experience is via radio. It is a massive vehicle for understanding, experiencing, and even just transmitting music. And that sort of gives us a very different context, that way of thinking about those two things. So let's move on to this world of promo. And this will go really quickly, so hang in there. And if this thing starts smoking, that's an accomplishment for me. I'm happy if I break a projector. All right, so oftentimes you sell some tracks, and in exchange for the tracks, right, you'd like a little bit of money. Either as a songwriter for the mechanicals on there, or as an artist selling it straight up. And ideally, you'd like to sell as much as you can, right, and make as much as you possibly can. Live music, same, right? Fill the seats, make some cash. That's sort of the objective. So we can think of this as a series of artist revenue streams: merchandise, tracks, live, licensing, and then just general fans, and we won't put a price tag on them at this point in time, because that makes people awkward. So let's follow an artist, sort of how they might start and work through this system. They do a live show, they get a little cash, but actually they do the show for free, because they're new and young, right? They have to play Arlene's Grocery in New York and actually pay just to show up. In hopes of maybe selling some CDs, right? So they sell a few CDs at the show after, unfortunately, performing for free. They get into this CD thing a little bit, but decide to give a bunch of CDs away rather than sell them in hopes of, right, finding more fans. So then they find a few more fans, they sell a few more live tickets, right, and maybe even some merchandise at the show. Although I think a few of us sell watches, but that's okay, we'll let that one go. So they make a little extra money with merchandise now by developing this fan base, using free music to develop a fan base. And then they started licensing music a little bit, but because that market gets a little competitive, they do a few of these early licenses sort of for free, kind of for the follow-on and the residuals, as we know. They find a few more fans that way, and some sort of benevolent cycle sort of happens, right? By way of this fans sort of filling more seats, buying more tracks, and buying more merchandise. Whatever, I guess there's hoodies in there. That's more realistic, I guess. And even maybe more licenses, right? More TV shows, music services, the whole thing. A lot of it is based on licensing, by the way. I'm very proud of the fact that I remember to do that. Sorry. That's one of those words that really gets me. But where are you in this? One of your composers, publishers, lyricists, right? Oftentimes, the story that people know of as the artist revenue stream is actually the story of the performing artist. They don't necessarily know your position in this market, what happens to a live show and how you get paid if you're not the performer, right? They don't actually understand how songwriters, lyricists, and publishers fit into this system. So that's your responsibility, frankly, to sort of let them know how you fit into that system and where you're part of that value. But let's have fun with a little play-by-play, like it's a sports field, right? So we got live, you do this, then you get a little bit of money, and we're going to sort of track the person through this whole system, right? Then they do a little free, and then off they go. They give those CDs away. We're kind of, this is the replay. Do they do this on TV here? With the arrows, and they draw everything, sort of all the play. So now you do some shows, and then we're back to a little merchandise. Then we get a little licenses, a little bit of free, find some more fans, sell some more discs. And we sold some more discs, and then, okay, we got some live shows, sell some more watches, and then maybe licensing, right? So now if we take away the pretty picture, right, free even almost has a shape. There's all these feedback loops for free for an artist as well, right, where you're doing some things for a little bit less than usual in hopes of making greater money in other markets and stuff like that. So we know that free has a place. It's not always a good place, but it's a place in sort of this system. And this is now copyrighted work, by the way, The Shape of Free, a work in progress. So let's move on to this service category and sort of classify it and understand it a little bit. Indirect examples, not direct music examples, indirect because we're more familiar with these. You drop a box somewhere, throw a bunch of cables in a neighborhood, voila, cable television, right? Throw a satellite up in the sky, broadcast down to earth, satellite television, right? These are services for which we all pay. We turn on the TV and we just get video. We get moving images and sound, sort of a flowing experience. Now that's happening more and more in the music market, correct? More and more of these music services are emerging, and that's how they're classified. So let's think about them a little bit. We're going to slow down. So one of the questions that you worry about with this is revenue per user. How much does each user pay to have service, right, to get the service? Spotify is here. RDO is here. Deezer are here. And is there a fourth music service here now? I think those are the three main ones. Also total revenue, because you could also imagine that however many people sign up for these services, that adds to a big pool of money, and that's worth something. So regardless of how much each user pays, can you maximize sort of the total pool of money? And how about this revenue per unit? Now, when you're paid in these services, you're paid for every listen to every song, right? And what does that look like? The value of each little stream to each person for every track. And somehow we're trying to optimize this, right? And if you think about this in your head, this is a difficult dance. Do we want to make the most per user? Do we want to make the most per stream for our tracks? Or do we want the biggest pool of money for everybody? That's kind of an interesting debate around these things. So let's focus on these two right now. Conveniently, in the UK, there was a survey done around sort of how much people would pay for a subscription music service, and by complete coincidence, Kylie Minogue was on the cover of the magazine. And so people just answered sort of these price ranges they would pay for music. And this is how we get these data usually, and it frustrates people like me, because it doesn't really give you anything to make sense of. You don't really know how to work with this. So let's work with it a little bit. We'll make it into tables form first. So on the bottom there is all the prices, these sort of categories, the bins in which people were asked to sort of comment whether they would pay or not. And then on the left is sort of the percentage of the respondents who said they would willingly pay that price. And even with this, we can't really work that well yet. So let's make a demand curve so we can actually start to work with these data. How many took economics or economics in university or high school or at any time? So now we're going to make a demand curve the way I make demand curves, because otherwise I don't understand how they do them. All we're going to do is add up these bins on the bottom. That's all that really happens to understand supply and price. So we've got this bin where 1% of basically the respondents said they would do it at $10.99. And all we do is just move the bins across. All right? All you're doing is summing up the bins to get all total supply on the bottom. And you end up with this sort of chunky demand curve. Now this is important because we can now think like rational, profit-maximizing individuals possessing all of the information we need, if only for a moment, and try to figure out how we can make the most possible money out of this demand curve. So if we give every little space a calculation, so 1% of the user base, or basically the population, willing to pay $10.99. In the UK, it ended up at about 6.8 billion pounds per month of revenue from a music service. And these are all the rest of these will then be in monthly terms as well. And as you can see, what happens is the value per month goes up for a while, and then it goes back down again. And that's the maximizing the revenue issue. It has to do with the slope of the line, and I don't want to go into that. So you can now figure out where is the pool biggest, given these data, assuming they're somewhat correct. What you find is actually at £3.99 for a music service, 23% of this population claimed they would sign up then, and the pool grows to 57 billion pounds. Is anybody paying $3.99 for a music service? Right, this is frightening to many people, lowering price this low, but if it could sign up that many more users, you've now sort of maximizing revenue. And in fact, in this pile, it maximizes around $2.99, which is about a third, or less than a third in certain countries. It's about a third in the UK for what people are paying. This is frightening for many people to think about actually lowering the price of music to get more people paying, but we have to entertain it and understand it and see if it's true. At premium pricing, it ended up being about £8.4 million a month, and that's sort of the equivalent to the $11.99 price here. So now let's look at this revenue per unit, because this one gets more attention in the world. So if you remember a year and a half ago, or maybe a little longer, 2010, oh my God, that's 2 years ago now. Wow, this century is going quickly. She made 108 pounds per million plays. For those of you that can do math in your head, that's a really tiny number per play, right? Or converted to US dollars or Aussie dollars. So basically, 1/100th of a penny was the payment per play. So we need to address this. That was a significant anomaly for a portion of the monies she received, for a portion of the songwriting at a very early time in the life cycle of Spotify. So when I look at artist statements, not from any organization here, but from artists actually sharing their statements, so independent artists, I'll get anywhere between 1/10 of a penny to almost a full penny for streams, depending upon the circumstances that it occurred and the artist deal that they have. All right, so the payments are nothing near 1/100th of a penny. But the actual model, if you look below, it gets pretty muddy. So in the simplest version, you'd get a proportion of total streams. If you're 10% of all streams, you get 10% of the money. In certain countries or certain deals, there may actually be a per stream minima. So you get at least a certain amount for every stream. Hello. You may also get certain guarantees to certain labels, which they don't want to talk about, and these other sort of non-disclosable features. So these models are actually very complicated, but in their simplest form, it's just your streams as a proportion of total streams. So simple example, $11.99 subscriber fee, take away 30% for the carrier, for the company, $8.40 left to be a royalty pool, 5,000 total number of songs they listened over a month by your Uncle Bob. 100 of those songs were yours. 2% of the royalty pool belongs to you, both the songwriter, the owner of the work, publisher, the whole pie, right? And you get about 16, almost 17 cents, right? Not an overwhelmingly large number, but the effective rate there for every stream is about 1/15th of a penny. That makes great headlines, but that assumes the person is listening to music 11 hours a day, nonstop, 30 days a month. How many of you listen to music 11 hours a day, nonstop? We have one, all right. So there's risk, right? So now we know this is actually what matters is how often and how long people are listening to music, right? If we adjust this for 3 hours of music a day, now it goes to about more than half a penny for every play. All right, so the payments can, in a perfect music service licensing world, this is how the payments would probably work, and it's more sensitive to how aggressively or for how long people listen to music. Now, at this point in time, you should ask yourself, how did I get here? Monday morning dealing with this, and haven't I seen something like this before? So let's say there's a radio station, and it makes a lot of money, and then it's licensed at a particular rate, and you end up with, say, $5 million as a license pool. And we're in a country where distribution from radio is in fact flat, as opposed to the US, where we use all sorts of magic formulas that no one needs to know about in order to decide how people get paid. Now there's 365 days a year, 24 hours in a day, and we'll just say 12 songs an hour from most radio stations. And I can't believe how simple that is, actually. You get to 105,000 spins per year for this station, and now you can calculate what every spin is worth. $47.52. This is a hypothetical example. Don't quote this as now. You get $47.52 for every spin, all right? Hypothetical example. I will calculate this for Australia, though, in a little bit. So at this point in time, you should be wondering, Dave, $47 is definitely not equal to like half a penny, a little bit more than half a penny. That's true, but the problem is you're comparing spins to streams, and that happens all the time when people get their royalty statements from radio versus something like RDO or Deezer or whatnot. Spins to streams, and spins are to all listeners when you calculate that, right? You get a station and a play, you don't know how many listeners are there. Streams are to each listener. So we have to convert this, oranges to apples or spins to streams, okay? So let's say there's a $60 million royalty pool collected from radio for both sets of rights. Same number of years, same number days per year, hours, songs per hour. 570.78 is the value of all spins across all stations at any moment in time in Australia, all right? That ends up to be half of a penny, all right? So half of 1% of a penny per listener. But it's intriguing, right, because the pool of money is actually quite large. So you don't see it in a per listener basis, in a per track basis. You actually see it in a large amount of money per spin. And this assumes basically only about 1,000 listeners per hour throughout the day on average. So at certain peak times here, there are 7 to 10 million people listening, and other peak times there's only 5 million or 2 million or 1 million or 500,000. So now you find out that actually streams can be worth more than spins. And yet people don't often make that comparison. They see the tiny little number from a music service, but they don't usually see their radio payments in the same sort of way. We could do the same for record sales, but I can tell you right now you make more from a sale, okay? But if you think of it as an annuity, someone buys a track and listens to it for the rest of their life. However many times they listen to that track, that's actually the value of every listen. And you can calculate the values there. And that's why Lady Gaga eventually did exclusives with Spotify. If she was paying too little, she would never do that. Well, maybe she would, because it's pretty cool. So let's move on to this platform stage now. Let me see where I am. Oh, good. Examples. All right, radio, free platform, you license it just the way it is, right? We try to do that. Television, same thing. Free platform, licensed as it is, however it determines to make money, and that's what the organizations that are putting projects like this together, that's what they do, right? They basically license these things. But when we encounter the internet, right, this thing, we just say, you gotta be kidding. How are we gonna license this, right? On both sides oftentimes. Or wireless networks, right, mobile networks, we sort of look at that and say, no. How do you license that? This is totally different. The files are moving and people get to keep them. So there's oftentimes this response, graduated response. In France, they gave a survey after instituting graduated response. They found that 50% of the people stopped being naughty. 49% did not necessarily stop being naughty. The challenge here would be when there's a service monitoring your behavior online and you're asked, did you change your behavior? Are you likely to sort of say that you changed your behavior? You have to watch surveys in these contexts because oftentimes you'll give people the answer you'd like them to hear. So we want to look at actual behavior. Sweden has a graduated response policy called IPRED. The day it went into effect, internet traffic dropped by 30%. Wow, right? Within 6 months, it was actually back to where it was before, and by now, or the spring of 2011, it was up 30%. There's reason to believe that this was actually one entity pulling media off the network, and then over time, the folks that measure traffic actually figured out how to measure it. So it wasn't necessarily related to file sharing. In particular, it was moving files around a CDN. New Zealand has a graduated response policy, right? So we'll rip through this. These are their numbers over the last 4 years. Importantly, the year of the policy, sales fell dramatically in New Zealand. So before the policy went into effect, that year got crushed, right? And then the next year, sales were up. That's happened before, by the way, in other countries, where the year before graduated response, there's sort of a madness for acquiring files, and then it settles down. And notice also that these growth rates change. So while digital sales, which is down below, are going up, they actually went up at a slower rate in 2011, although I think they're spiking up again in 2012. The data's really muddy around this policy. And for someone like me, I have to ask, what's happening in general? And it's challenging because there's really only 4 or 5. There's a small set of countries that have these policies, so getting it in general is very difficult. But I'll do it anyway. So all countries were down, 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 down from 2008 to 2011. Countries without a graduated response policy, similar, down and seemingly to a greater level, right? Countries with a graduated response policy, note that this will be the first year when those go into effect. This is the first year after graduated response. One of the challenges is there's something different about those countries even before graduated response begins. They were up the same year the other countries were down, right? So we have to start to think about this a little bit. And also, because of such the massive variation in terms of the sales movements in different countries, there is no way difference between 3% and 5% is actually significant statistically. They're just kind of the same from an academic perspective. So we need to look at these more closely, and I'll skip this. This is the countries without graduated response, going down 6.5, 5, 8.5, and 5% each year. We're going to look at the change in the change. So the rate of decline increases in that year, and the rate of decline decreases in this year. All right, so we're sort of adjusting for this downward trend and saying, for these countries, 2011, where the other countries have graduated response, but they don't, there was actually a decrease in the decline. While they're going down at a slower rate. Countries with graduated response, we have to take into account this little moment, right, where things were going up in the year before. There's actually a significant increase in the rate of decline in the year in which the policy sort of started to take effect, and then another increase again, all right, in the year after that. So there's some sort of reversion to the mean. That's what we would call this here. The policies, and it's so muddy, it's very difficult. And here's the other reason it's muddy. Anytime there's a GR policy, which these are their lovely names, that's the most normal one. Oftentimes a music service or some other big project goes live at the same time. So as a researcher, I can't tease those two apart. I can't tell the difference if those two things happen at the same time. Only in South Korea were they separated by a while, and this is their biggest music service, streaming music service. And this was their graduated response. So there was a major uptick as soon as they started to do music services, which is interesting. So might your anti-piracy efforts feel like this? Do they play this game here? Oh yeah. Poor mole. So let's ask, what if the internet was made for sharing files? And I'm not advocating file sharing. I'm saying, what if this is what it's designed to do? Okay? True or false, let's understand it. Got a computer, got a second computer, plug them in together with a cable, give one an ID, we'll call it Bob, the other one, give it an ID, call it Doug. Now I can tell the two computers apart, right? Boom, we're file sharing. Right? That's called a network. Right? That is a local network on any computer. All right, give them both IP addresses because that's cooler, it's a longer number. And then we'll give them a URL. We'll attach them on a really long cable, right? And now we'll string a bunch of them together, connect them by cables or wireless things, and that's the internet. That's basically it. It is a network of networks, right? So bear in mind that anytime you go to a URL, bob.com/xxx, you're just going to a folder on a computer somewhere. And anytime you read a web page, like the home page of most websites, you're reading a file on a computer somewhere. Most importantly, you're not reading it there. You've downloaded it to your computer, and you've cached it so you could read it locally. So the thing is kind of made to do this, and that's a challenge. That is a significant challenge for all of these policies or all of these efforts, right? Is that this is basically sort of the design of it is to move files around. So we'll think again about these pirates, externalities with a boat. One thing to worry about is you may be competing with the basic design of the internet as you try to manipulate or try to deal with how files move around. It may work or it may not work, but the thing is sort of made to do what it's doing, and that's a challenge. Other options, there's the carbon approach where you sort of say there's a baseline level of piracy. We'll get paid above and not paid below. There's a blanket licensing approach which other people have proposed. And then there's sort of a value chain approach where you might license an ISP the same way you license a radio station, and then they provide services to MSPs on top. It's an awful lot to think about. Do I have 10 minutes? Okay, I can't really tell. So let's go on to pricing without price tags, and we'll rip through this, but there'll be some really big numbers, so it'll be fun. All right? Assumption disclosure. I assume very few of you sit and watch your router for fun, right? Even though your DSL here comes naked, which is great, I doubt that data is what you want. So while they're charging you more for data, $10 here, is it data that you're hanging out with? I don't know. Let's look. What does data look and sound like? So this is a mashup of New York Times data and also this guy, Ono Lab, who basically made the internet make sound. I don't know. That's not that great. Is it any better with an amen loop? Anybody know the amen loop? No, not any better, right? So we're not really into the data thing, right? So there's probably something else going on. While we're being charged for data, we're probably paying for something else. We need to think about that. So this next slide is rated E for econobabble, so we'll just go right past it. Because in simple American English, is content plus, is a connection with content worth more than a connection without it? And replace the word content with music. We need to come up with a new word, by the way, than content. It's the hardest thing to come up with. Is one word that covers film, music, words, images, and that captures the creativity and also the fact that it's culture and form. So now it's time for some good old-fashioned hedonic pricing. Example number one, which I call straight up with a twist. We go to France. Oh my God, it's 28 euros for internet plus TV plus phone, which seems really cheap, except you have to get this box, then you have to pay for this line. So before you know it, it's 47 euros to get the internet. But actually, I'm done here because you've separated out content from the connection. So I have a plus, so boom. So somehow people are paying extra for the content. That's too simple. That's cheating. And it also treats as if we sort of first had the internet, and then we got TV and the telephone, which isn't the case, right? We first had those things, and then we got the internet. So what if this is how it sort of works? There's content and a connection. We pay to be connected to each other and to culture, but also pay for content separately. Who prices content separately and first? Well, fortunately, if you go to the UK, Sky does, and they basically charge £24.50 for Sky TV and £12.50 for the connection, your internet connection. They pull it out separately. So that's like a 60-30 split between content or the connection. If you want to go cheap, you pay £19.50 for content, £5 for a connection, which is insane. And it's about $76.25. So the majority of the money paid is actually for the media, the content, the creative stuff that we actually watch. So now we've got this 70-30 split. There's another way to look at it. Let's think of it in terms of time. In terms of Americans and how we spend our time online, 16.9% of our time is spent with video, music, text, or entertainment of some kind. And that's about €5 per month out of the internet fees. And that's just the time spent online. It doesn't count stuff we download and listen to later. Note, this is not an estimate of the total value of content. It's the option to access content while online. And there's other direct payments that you might make, some of which you pay directly, some of which you may not. Now let's look at internet traffic. 29 billion gigabytes of data in 2011. Let's look at it by type. Asia Pacific, about 64% of the data was from licensed sources, 36 from unlicensed. Europe, 60-40, licensed versus unlicensed sources. And by unlicensed, I'm talking, sorry, BitTorrent. I know a significant proportion, but not all might be unlicensed. Latin America, about 76-25. So now we're just looking at it as a proportion of traffic, all right? So roughly about 34% of total downstream traffic may be unlicensed content. And that's not a finger-pointing effort. We actually all pay for that because we pay so the network can operate. All right, so we're all paying for that, whether we do it or whether we grab unlicensed content or not. And about, on average, 64% is downstream traffic that may be licensed content. So we're really out of, say, a €30 a month bill, which is $40 here, which is close to where we are. About 10 euros of it is for unlicensed content. People are paying for it. We're all paying for it, actually, because the network is a shared resource. So we're all paying to basically be able to handle that traffic. The question is what portion of it, where does it go, and how does it get distributed? Big numbers, $293 billion consumer mobile and wireless access in 2011. The total value of the consumer market doesn't account business to business. 2015, it should grow to about 407 billion, I believe. That's almost 408. So if I just do my percentage game, that's $99 billion for unlicensed traffic. Is that greater or less than the global entertainment industry in sales dollars? That's greater, in case you're curious. But there's also software in there. But you might say, Dave, are you high? Right? Because that's a really big number. So let's just pretend it's only 10 or 25%. We'll go even lower. Okay? We got 40 million at a 10% of demand and 101 million at 25% demand in 2015. And that's saying some proportion of the traffic has not been licensed, but people are paying some amount in order for it to be on the network. Those big numbers, right? Is it a pool of money worth pursuing, worth thinking about? Can we think of media on network that's unlicensed as something that has value, and that value can be transferred as opposed to something that can be eliminated? So we got radio, right? How do we respond to radio? We can license it, right? We got television. How do we respond to television? We license it. There we go. Now we license it, right? And they can actually play whatever music they want. They don't have to ask first, unless they need to sync right? Then they need to ask. Oops. Go on to the television and a cable network, right? You license that. Thank you very much. Yes, indeed, when we go off to satellites, right? You license music. You license moving objects. That's pretty cool, by the way. But again, when we get back to this internet thing, which is running oftentimes on the same cable infrastructure, you're joking, right? Both parties are sort of hesitant to deal with how could we license this. Alternatively, over mobile networks, which will become increasingly hotbeds of sharing once they hack out some of the phones. Same thing, right? It's kind of crazy talk. But can you license networks like networks? If there's value there, how could you transfer that value in a way that's fair, in a way that sort of treats people as they are, and sort of finds the value of media on these networks? Or can you sort of ask yourself, are these networks worth more with content than without? If you take the content away, do they sort of lose their value? And that's value you could have instead. That's it. So now it's time, I guess, for the little finish. Are we ready? Is everybody ready for their Monday? So those were some big questions, right? A lot of big numbers, big questions. In the event of emergency or a slightly wider screen. Oh, this one's not wide enough. That one. Oh, good, it all fit. Remember, music is not a product. You make products, or I guess you sell them as products, but you know it's not a product, right? Music is not a service. We call these things services, but it's not a service, right? Music is something way cooler than that, right? Music is an experience. We package it and present it in different ways, but ultimately what you're paying for, what you're doing, is something that you want to experience, you want to be a part of, right? It's a sensory experience. It's something you hear, you feel, I guess in certain venues you taste, and that makes it an information experience, right? We can convert it something, at least the audio, into something we can move from place to place easily. It's a personal experience, right? Sometimes with white earbuds in our hair, in our heads, but also just it's something that just grabs people where they are. It's a social experience. It's often done together, and more media online will be done socially. And it's a cultural experience, right? And culture is something that we all share. I don't mean that in the file sharing way. I mean culture is what we have in common. Right? And that is what's amazing about music, is it's something that binds people together. It's something they have in common. It's also a financial experience, right? It's some way for someone, or many someones, to make a living. So I just ask that you value that experience. Look for it wherever you can. Thank you.